next thing you're going to learn in your Latin life is something called the sequence of tenses. Later when you need to take a look when you're doing your homework, a lot of this information is on page 34 in your chart book. I'm going to present it in a slightly different way here today. We need to do a review first, though, about different kinds of clauses. Now, you've learned an independent clause has a subject and a verb and can stand alone as a sentence because it expresses a complete thought. The Roman legion attacked the fortified wall. That's a complete sentence. Has a subject, Roman legion, has a verb, attacked, but it makes sense. It doesn't feel like it's missing anything to you. A dependent clause has a subject and a verb, just like an independent clause, but it does not make sense on its own. It does not express a complete thought, and it can't be a sentence. So here, the Roman legion attacked the fortified wall. I have written that again. By itself, it's a complete sentence, but I'm adding a dependent clause, which was 4 meters thick. It has a subject, which, it's a pronoun, right? Relative pronoun. It has a verb, was, but if I just said, which was 4 meters thick, you're going, what was? It doesn't make sense by its own. You know it's not a complete sentence. So that is called a dependent clause. Now, you've learned independent clause uses for subjunctives. We did potential, we did jussive, we did optative. If you need a review, those are in your chart book. You've also learned a use for the subjunctive where a dependent clause is introduced by the adverb ut. We call that an ut clause. Now, before we go on to sequence of tenses, you need to understand them in English before you can understand them in Latin. They'll make way more sense in English. So if I said the dog was tired because he is chasing the UPS driver. So just listen to that. The dog was tired because he is chasing the UPS driver. Or if I said the dog was tired because he will be chasing the UPS driver. You go, wait a second. That doesn't make any sense in English. It sounds wrong. And what should it be? Let's change the verb. The dog was tired because he had chased the UPS driver. Or the dog was tired because he was chasing the UPS driver. Those make sense. What you know in English already, that's called the sequence of tenses. And in Latin, you need to understand the sequence of tenses in order to read and translate dependent clauses, which we're going to talk about now, that have a verb in the subjunctive. All right. Now, the tense of the subject verb in a dependent clause is determined by the tense of the main verb, or the tense in the independent clause. Okay, I'm going to say it again. The tense of the verb in the dependent clause, remember our dependent clause is right here. This tense is determined by the tense in our independent clause or our main clause. All right? Now, let's look at this. If the verb in the independent clause is indicative, that means the action either happens now, after now, or before now, okay? So, if the verb in the independent clause is subjunctive, means the action happens the same time as the main verb, after the main verb, or before the main verb. Don't be confused. I'm going to walk you through it. What you're going to need to do is first determine the tense. I'm going to make this smaller here so you can see more of it, okay? So this is also in your chart book if you want to open your chart book and follow along. So you first need to determine if the verb in the main clause is a primary sequence verb, and the primary sequence verbs are present, future, or future perfect, okay? A secondary sequence verbs are imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect. The main verb can be indicative or subjunctive. Remember the main verb in the clause, in the independent clause, if you took it apart by itself, it would be a complete sentence. Now, if the main clause verb, so primary sequence verb, you're going to first determine the tense of the verb in the independent clause is a primary or a secondary sequence verb. Now, if the main clause verb is from the primary sequence and the dependent clause subjunctive verb occurs at the same time or after or was completed before the independent clause verb, okay? So that's if it occurs at the same time or after the main verb, this means the action has not happened or is not finished at the time of the main verb. You would conjugate the dependent clause verb as a present tense subjunctive. So here we go. We've determined we're in a primary sequence. We've determined that it happened at the same time or after the main verb. That means the action has not happened or is not finished. We're going to do it at present, same time or after. So if I said, I fear that you will leave, right? The action is going to be completed. The leaving will happen after the fearing. After the fearing. So what you need to do is you translate it as a present tense. Here it is right here. A present tense subjunctive. Timeo ne habeas. Right? I fear that you will leave. Even if this is in future, right? You translate the subjunctive as present. Now let's look at it the other way. If I'm taking it from a Latin, in English, I fear that you are leaving. So fearing is happening in the present tense. That means it's a primary sequence. You are leaving is also present tense. Guess what? Happening at the same time. Guess what? Our subjunctive is present tense. And you may be going, wait a second. Wait a second. They are exactly the same thing in Latin. Timeo ne habeas, timeo ne habeas. Yet the English is different. That is correct, right? I'll tell you why in just a minute, okay? You have to use common sense and context clues to help distinguish a same time situation from an after situation. Either if I just gave you timeo ne habeas, you could translate it either I fear that you are leaving or I fear that you will leave. And I don't give you any other context. I give you that sentence by itself. Yes, you can translate it either way because we don't know it. The subjunctive is in the present tense if it's after or the same time. All right. Now, if it is before, right? If the subjunctive verb happens before, I do not know when you left. You see, this happened before I knew. You left before I knew. What happens is now what we need to do is we need to conjugate the dependent clause verb right here in as a perfect tense subjunctive. So here we go. This is in the perfect subjunctive. All right. There's only one choice for that, so you're okay. Again, you always have to use good common sense. You have to make good English sense when you're translating that. Okay. Now, let's secondary sequence. So if the main clause verb is from the secondary sequence and the subjunctive verb in the dependent clause occurs at the same time or after the main verb, this means the action has not happened or is not finished at the time of the main verb, you would conjugate the dependent clause verb as an imperfect tense subjunctive. Okay, I ask why you were leaving. So the asking is going on at the same time as the leaving. And when you do that, we're going to do imperfect. Imperfect subjunctive. Okay? I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Here we go. Now, timebam ne abires. I feared that you would leave. We have the same, do you notice? Still it's in the imperfect. But it's after. In the English, it's after. The leaving, right? The fearing. When is this going to happen? The leaving is happening after the fearing. Again, use common sense and context clues to help you tell a same time situation from an after situation. Remember, the translation needs to make good English sense. So if I just gave you the sentence, either of these sentences all by themselves, you would translate them as the same thing. It wouldn't be wrong because we don't have context. All right. If the action has been completed at the time before the main verb occurred, then you would conjugate the dependent clause as a pluperfect. So if it happens before, use the pluperfect. All right. I did not know when you had left. When did the leaving happen? The leaving happened before he knew. All right. So nescebam quando abivisis. So what we're going to use is we're going to use the pluperfect. This is the easiest one of all because the before situation has only one choice for English translation per sequence. So that is easier. So if we go up to our chart, okay, the before only has one. If it's in primary sequence, it's just verbed. If it's before in the secondary sequence, it's had verbed. So there's only one step if the subjunctive verb occurs at the had before the main verb is completed. There's two choices here. There's two choices if it occurred the same time or after the main verb. And you just have to use context or your good English sense to decide. I know this can be confusing. We're going to practice it a lot in class, but you need to be able to hear it and kind of work through the process together. All right, back to our chasing dog. The dog was tired because he had chased the UPS driver. Or I could say the dog was tired because he was chasing the UPS driver. Just remember that I had two choices. I could do after or same time, right? Because I'm in the imperfect. I'm actually in the primary sequence here. Nobody had to tell you that. You didn't have to think about that. But because you've spoken English for so long, you're in the primary. You know that's the primary sequence, and I have two choices. I don't know the context, so there's no context to let us know if the chasing was going on or had been completed by the time the dog was tired. So that's why we can translate our dog chasing sentence into Latin using either was chasing or had chased. Okay, watch that again if you need to. Promise we will walk through it lots in class. I just need you to start sorting out the process that you need to translate those kinds of sentences using sequence of tenses. Page 34 and page 35 have lots of examples for you.